we can get started with this one. Thank you for being here for this session. I'm Trudy Smit Quosai, and I'm from the Ontario Problem Gambling Research Centre in Ontario, Canada. And we did have a little bit of shift in our session time because very sadly we have to fly back to Canada this afternoon, and it is going to be so much colder than it is here. It's breaking our hearts already. So the paper that I'm presenting and that Heather Chalmers will also be presenting. Heather is on the board of directors for our center and is also faculty at Brock University. The paper was actually, or the response framework, was created by Michael Goodstadt and Diane Santesso. They were not able to be here, so we have the pleasure of being in New Zealand to present it. Michael Goodstadt is a research scientist a consulting research scientist with the center, and Diane Santesso was the research officer and has now taken a faculty position elsewhere. So that kind of orients you to what we're doing. We're calling this a research response planning framework. And what it is a first way to try to bring together a lot of the research that has been done in problem gambling. We have looked at the causes or the origins, the effects, and now we're overlaying some of the solutions, some that you talked about, John. So let me walk through the steps of what we were doing, and then Heather is actually going to turn this into a bit more of a workshop. So we're going to, like John, ask you to step up and talk with us about this framework, because it's early days, and we're still developing it, so your feedback is going to be very helpful as we go through. An important thing for me to note is that we have not evaluated the weight of this evidence. What was looked at when the framework was pulled together is what's out there in terms of evidence. So an obvious next step is looking at evaluating and against set criteria. Just a quick word about who we are. We are located in Guelph, Ontario, which is about an hour west of Toronto, if that helps you orient. We've just gone through a transition. So for the last 13, 14 years, we played a fairly significant role in funding research, both within the province, the country, and internationally. That has now changed, and the ministry is funding the research directly, and we've moved on to translate knowledge and support evidence-based decision-making about gambling to reduce its potential for harm. So that's a big shift for us, and one that we're quite excited about. Essentially, getting the research into the hands of the people who can use it. This research response framework builds on our conceptual framework of factors influencing harmful gambling. And I don't know, just show of hands, have people seen this framework? Some of you have? Okay, you can even get it on your tablet right now. This was an international collaboration of esteemed researchers around the world who came together and helped us pull together the best evidence in harmful gambling and put it together in this framework. It's extremely cool, and I can say that because I wasn't part of OPGRC when they put it together. But if you go onto our website, and I'll give you the website in a sec, you can click on any of these boxes, and it will give you a summary of, for example, social demographic factors, and then all the research that informed that. So I won't be offended if you play around in your tablet and go to our website and play with that a little bit. But also, listen with half an ear too, and then especially when Heather comes up to talk at least about the framework. So this framework really looked at some of the origins or causes and effects, and now what we're overlaying is the responses. And let me walk through a little bit what we've done there. So just to reiterate, we are building on the conceptual framework. We're integrating the research evidence, laying on the solutions or responses. And through that process, we feel that it's giving us a window into some of the gaps in the research and some of the gaps in responding to problems related to gambling. And to do this, to pull all of this research together, Michael and Diane used two processes. They used a problem and solution tree approach and also used conceptual mapping. And I will talk just quickly about those approaches before Heather takes the stage. So the problem and solution tree metaphor really looks at identifying the root causes, and you can see clearly that analogy, right, the root, and then branching up into the effects. And this is a process that's been used to take very complex situations and help us identify the interrelations and what happens when we superimpose different levels. So essentially, we look at the causes and the effects of the problem. We look at the solution, and does that cause a reduction in the effects of the problem? And then integrate the solution, its operation on the causes, and then what do we see in the effects, and then focus on problem gambling. So I'll walk through a little bit what Michael and Diane actually did. Oh, sorry, jump into. So then they took all of that and put it onto a concept map. This is just to show you that they put it onto a concept map. We'll talk a little bit more in detail later. So the first thing they did was identify the issue, or identify the focus of their research. And starting with the broader area of gambling, by exclusion, non-gambling, the continuum of responsible gambling, and their focus was on problem gambling. And I know we've had some very interesting discussions about language and problem gambling as opposed to other terms that we might use that take the onus off the individual. We're sticking with problem gambling because that is how they organized their search for this study, but I think it's an interesting discussion to have around language. So the first step, or the second step that they did, was to take from the conceptual framework and then extend that research search so that it was current, the harmful effects of gambling. And I think most of you are quite familiar with the harmful effects. They look broadly in societal and economic impacts, and then interpersonal and social impacts. And I think many of you could identify what those impacts are. Steps 3 and 4 looked at pulling the origins of problem gambling. So again, where we have a fairly stronger research base in what we might call the risk factors or the causal factors. Things like your social reference group, or the gambling environment, as John just described. Personality issues, or as Jessica said, co-occurring factors like alcohol use that might influence harmful gambling. So that creates the problem tree. The solution tree then looks at what kinds of interventions that we have, and certainly echoing that we really do need more systematic and longitudinal evaluation of these interventions to know what in fact does work. But what is laid out here is, what are the things on the table? What are the things that have been done? So for example, education, addressing the marketing of gambling, looking at access and ability, access to ATMs, and specific treatments like CBT or brief therapies. So the final step is to integrate these. So what we're really looking at is, what are our responses? Do they match up with what we've seen as the origins or the causes? Does that have an effect? Does it do anything with what we see in the effects of problem gambling? And do we have an overall reduction in harm? By sort of matching up these, we're able to see where our gaps are in terms of understanding problem gambling, understanding the research base, and where our gaps in response have been. So from these nice little trees, and I have to tell you too, many of you won't know Michael Goodstaff, but I think it's fair to say that he did not grow up using computer technology. And he drew all these little trees using his cursor, which I think is really kind of fun. So the next step was to create a conceptual map, because a very important piece of understanding this picture of the research literature is the interrelations. And I don't expect that you'll be able to, perhaps even see these. But this first conceptual map takes the factors that can influence problem gambling and the harmful effects. So looking at how they go across and how they are so very interrelated. It gets even more complicated when we superimpose or more complex when we superimpose the responses. This is using a determinants of health framework as an overall framework. But what I would like you to take from this image is just the complexity of the interactions that are going on and the importance to consider all of those. So having very quickly gone through the process, I'm going to pass it over to Heather, who is going to talk about, in broad terms, some of the gaps that were identified in terms of the research base and then our overall ideas about where this can go.
Okay, thank you. So as Trudy said, when we're looking at all the literature that is out there, and many of individuals throughout the conference and the think tank before spoke about there's a lot we don't know yet, or the strength of the evidence in particular areas is not quite as strong as we would like to help or hope for, but it is early days in the whole gambling field. But we identified three, just to give you an example of areas that we might want to take a closer look, thinking in terms of potential interventions, at-risk groups, and then in terms of outcomes, interrelations. So I'll just give you a better sense of what I mean by that. So if we think about the physical effects associated with problem gambling, there's been a lot of research done that looks at, well, what's physically going on in the body when you're gambling, so that perhaps a primary health care provider might recognize. So if they're presenting with high blood pressure, ulcers, heart palpitations, is that physician asking questions about their gambling? Can we establish through research some links to then be able to educate the primary care providers to start to ask questions? So if we don't establish through evidence that there are these links that can result in tangible outcomes, so that when we have trouble with identifying problem gamblers, maybe we need to be more creative and take a look what's going on early on so that we have another source to be able to identify problems. Okay. With respect to problem gambling in youth, there's been a lot of discussion over the years of this is perhaps an at-risk group. It may be a group that is even more susceptible with the onslaught of technology, with social gaming, what that potential connection is then to online gambling. We don't, Gerda talked about that yesterday, we don't know at this point if it's going to translate, if it's going to result in increased problem gambling. So we certainly need to look more at this issue in this population to understand more about it. But even what's happening right now with the youth, and the youth that are gambling at problematic levels, and pathological levels, what's the lost cost with respect to employment? What's the cost with respect to lost educational opportunities? So when we're thinking about social impacts of gambling, where is that research right now? Are we looking at those lost opportunities? And the third example that I want to talk about is the interrelations among the negative effects of problem gambling. We haven't quite yet, yes, isn't that cute? I bet you can't hit me with a quarter. We haven't really started to look, or I don't believe we've looked to a great extent of what the interrelations are among potential outcomes of problem gambling. So if we take an example of homelessness, for example, so you have how do financial consequences of problem gambling relate to homelessness? How, in turn, does homelessness relate to mental health problems? And then again, in turn, how do mental health problems relate back to problem gambling? You know, starting to try to understand all of these interconnectedness. What that also means is that we have to start connecting and thinking broader with other sectors. That maybe examining homelessness in and of itself, or mental health in and of itself. You know, we're doing problem gambling over here, but do we talk to each other? Do we connect so that we can see what are the potential interrelations and how does that impact on one's overall well-being? And what we feel is this approach is really important if we're wanting to increase the profile of gambling on the agenda of governments. We talked a fair bit, particularly in the think tank, about how do we get problem gambling more on a public health agenda, where there's the argument, well, you know, it's only a small percentage, and well, there's cancer, so that's where I want to put my resources. But if we have a better understanding of the interconnectedness and how widespread the impacts of gambling are, using the framework that we're proposing, using it as a way to set some research direction and research priorities, perhaps we can then start to talk about the true impacts of gambling so that it's more than just a physical thing or just affecting the individual or just individual and family. It really is a societal issue, and establishing a strong evidence base to make a bigger statement around why this is a public health issue. This needs to be something that isn't given lip service to, but rather it's an issue that resources are put towards, public policy is put into place to try and reduce those harms associated with gambling. So that's our thinking as where we can take this framework and try to organize it. Now, I'd be very interested to hear from your perspective, if I kind of go back to this sort of approach that overlays the traditional cause, behavior, and outcomes with solutions, what your initial reaction to something like this is. It is quite complicated. Just
I don't think it's really to the initiative. I don't think it could be very useful, but I wonder why economical factors is not seen as a general factor because it's on the macroeconomic level before, but here you have I guess it's socio.
yeah, it's lumped under the social economic factors.
Yeah, but still I think economic factors are much larger and they're many different. We have seen over-indebtedness is connected to problem. It's a lot of different economic issues. I think that is a very huge area for exploration.
Yeah. So if you look at this next slide, using the concept map, then which is really difficult to read, then we break it out a little more specifically to nuance it. You know, to try and put every every factor into the tree analogy, it got a little too complicated, and that's why there was the solution tree plus the concept map that tried to capture the large number of issues that can be and should be included. Yeah.
It's a little the same. I love the analysis. It's great. It's terrific. You know, playing with Canadians, great numbers. I love it. But you know, it is fundamentally a financial transaction going on, and so it's good that we're wondering about what's happening physically for the gambler. But we also need to be looking just as closely what's happening fiscally for the host. Because when you get a problem gambler like the guy from the refugee service who spent $5 million in the casino, what happened fiscally for the host is that they made $600,000 out of it. And we've got to temper everything about their behaviour with understanding that they did that well out of the transaction of this guy's suffering.
Yeah, I
I
hear what you're saying.
It's as important as his blood pressure.
And, you know, if you look at the revenues that the government agencies, or the governments get, it funds our healthcare system, it funds our education system. So the taxes associated, at least in Canada, it's structured that way. the taxes associated with that benefit us as individuals as well. So there's disproportionate risk, and how do you weigh all of that? There's the business model of the vendors, the harm of the individual, the benefits to society of those revenues. It is a complex, very political discussion.
Because I can't see
It
that
is
completely
difficult.
clearly. A person who's not gambling
Uh-huh.
is still frequently harmed by gambling.
Yes.
Do you think it shows that?
Well, there is a dotted line saying we need to explore more in terms of non-gambling and harmful gambling and the connections, and then because it's an indirect connection in a lot of ways, the harm. So the harmful gambling perhaps is an individual within your family, but it could be a societal, right? So, but to establish those connections, theoretically, we make arguments about these connections, but they haven't all been established. So we need to take it beyond that theory.
You might be paying anyway, even though you're not playing.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I found it really interesting. I am a politician. I'm a member of Parliament for the Greens in New Zealand. And just referring to the previous session that John ran, which was about pre-harm and post-harm, which seemed to me that a lot of this is about post-harm. Where is the line and how could it be used for prevention?
So, the pre-harm is here, addressing, if we understand what the root causes are, perhaps we can put mechanisms in place to stop the growth. Now, your comment, John, about, well, we have to also study, well, if we've stopped it, are there unintended harms? But even some of our interventions, like early interventions or trying to stop play or make you stop and think, but are there unintended consequences? I don't know if we have fully explored what those might be yet. And we can't lose sight of any efforts we do to minimize harm. There could be unintended consequences and wanting to look at that as well. But in this model, we're saying there's lots of different approaches, but if we target the root causes, then we have a ripple effect. It makes sense that if we're targeting the root causes, we can more successfully stop harm than if we come in the middle or we focus only on outcomes, then it's like treating symptoms as opposed to the cause. So if you have a cold and you just mask it with cold syrups and so on, you still have a cold, you're just not coughing as much. But if we address what is the root cause of that cold, then perhaps we can stop the cold. So it's that kind of mindset. Lots of research still needs to be done.
It's just that, the whole thing is that product is designed to create problems. And that was what was coming through in the first session as well, about the waves, the people at risk, and then they become problem gamblers. So focusing on the individual is, to me, it feels again like an attempt to medicalize or, and blame the victim, if you like. And we can spend a lot of time doing that, or we can look at pre-harm regulation and political solutions possibly as well, backed up with very strong evidence. But I just kind of worry about this. A lot of this, gambling exposure, psychological factors, biological factors, that it's all focused on the individual.
It's not intended to. So perhaps the way in which it has come across here, or the way in which we talked about it, may not have been as clear. Because there's a lot more that has gone into it. But it is. But if we look at the harms, I'm not sure I agree that the machines are designed to create harm. I don't think I'm not sure I agree with that. I think they're designed so that they want you to play and they're fun and enjoyment. The unintended consequence of that is that there is potential harm. I don't think there is this mindset. And there, we can have different, we can have different views on that.
It's really important to designing them.
Yeah, oh
Do you
yeah.
think it's just to make it fun?
It's to make money, right? It is to make money. But there's research that goes on right now trying to look at how can we minimize the potential harm that the ways in which the machines are created. So there are individuals that are doing research in that, and this is where the pop-up messaging has started to come. We still need to look more at all of it.
Can I just say that I see in there, like, partly it's one word policy, which can, maybe we can just imagine a whole lot of political will and decision making in there. And the other thing that was in the next couple of screens we had was the word drivers, and that's where I see the marketing and product manufacture and economic area, as in it's a driver. To sell product, that's the world we live in. Sell product, don't think about the consequences because it's an economic transaction, don't be emotional about it, and that's a huge driver. And I think drivers, I'm not sure if it's in there, but maybe it should be there. And that would take a step towards the needs and society
To address
that just been addressed there in a pictorial way.
Yeah. Sorry, I can't remember. I think Charles was getting
Yeah,
Sorry, I'm trying, the teacher me.
Thank you, yeah. I just came from the presentation by Ron Williams where he outlined his 2011 socioeconomic impact framework, and his argument is that essentially the impacts tend to be focused in particular communities in a small group of people in a population sense, and that therefore at a population level they tend to be fairly small. Although he did, the social harms he said tend to be negative, mildly to moderately negative. So, the social level gambling appears to have essentially negative impact on people, but they're concentrated in a small section of the community. That's certainly true in Australia, I think, and probably in New Zealand. So, the problem is, if you take this sort of broad approach to the harms of gambling, it's very easy for governments and for the majority of people, even though the majority of people are still concerned about it, to say, well, who cares, basically. And that seems to be the attitude which is largely taken. So, I think there's a lot of problems with that. One of them is that we can't measure an awful lot of things that are likely to be affected by gambling, including physical health effects at this stage, but you haven't even looked. But how do you respond to Rob's approach, and which is also being acted in Massachusetts? So how do you respond to that when you're looking at it in the way you are, which is much more a social health, public health framework?
Right. The challenge is trying to identify what the potential harms are and the missed opportunities, for example, I talked about. So how do we measure the missed educational opportunities, employment opportunities of youth? How do we measure that to capture the costs? So there are some softer costs that I don't think we capture right now, but I don't know if I have an answer to how to do that. If we do more research around interconnectedness, we perhaps will have a different measure or a way to understand the homelessness, financial problems to homelessness to mental health to problem gambling, and start to look at some of those cascading effects. Again, it's another way to measure that maybe ends up with a much bigger impact. I don't know yet because the research hasn't been done that has been able to track that over time. So we need that, and I don't want to keep coming back and saying we need more research, but we do. I think we have to think broader than let's just look at the problem gambler and their immediate family, because you're right, then the impacts are much smaller. But I don't have a definitive answer. But I think the first step is looking at interconnections.
Mine has a question, and I'm pretty ignorant on gambling world and with mental health and things like that. But it's just a question really to you and back to anybody, because I'm not very much inspired off by thinking about the need to gain experience from other industry, other sectors like tobacco and alcohol. connections between, not in terms of direct connections between ministries, but those
Similar
industries,
ideologies or?
so possibly, but basically using the same vehicle, and therefore, arguably and possibly using some of the same possible regulatory responses. Does anybody know, is there any research or opinion pieces or speculative ideas on that area?
I don't know a lot about it, but I suspect they're possibly further behind in terms of research than this area. Having looked at some of the other online kind of research, it's not as well developed as gambling, and gambling is not as well developed as drug and alcohol. So
But there are good enforcement techniques for monitoring, or relatively
yes,
good
yes.
law sanctions.
Yeah.
Easily
Yeah,
visible.
yeah, which has probably come from the vulnerability of children and that sort of access. So that information is going to be useful. I think that's been a major concern of our environment from the community levels about the potential vulnerability of children and Asian groups. Could potentially use that for similar kinds of programs.
I think while the federal government have forces to try to screen out monopoly, that there's not been as diligent trying to screen out some of the unlawful games unsuit. If you look in Australia, it's probably only one jurisdiction is really very, very proactive in terms of license question. Two of them. There's actually been YouTube licensing still through that sort of stuff, whereas most of us in the computer space license CAP and stuff. Some of us like license as well. So it's that it's not doesn't have this penetration and this I think and also what the license place and the online space is to regulate to certain extent like license whereas it's actually no regulation of some of those sea sites coming in. So I think the filters that the federal government are much more proactive in terms of censorship department as opposed to what the gambling space. In Australia, I think prosecuted one case in terms of unlawful
Okay, well, I think we are out of time, but I do want to thank you for your feedback and suggestions. We've made note of them. This is a work in progress, so I do appreciate your perspectives. Thank you.